Imagine being in excruciating pain, so much so that you wish you were dead. Unfortunately, you're being kept alive against your will. Sounds scary, right? It's worse than you can imagine. Certain real-life stories send a shiver down your spine when you hear them. One such story is of a Japanese man, Hisashi Ouchi, who lost most of his skin after being exposed to deadly radiation. Yet he was kept alive for 83 days against his will. In today's video, we'll be discussing his story. How was he exposed to radiation? What were its effects on his health? We'll be discussing all of these and more. The scary truth behind nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants are in many parts of the world and are used for making low-cost fuel. They also leave a much smaller carbon footprint compared to the traditional fossil fuels that we use. But there are not as many nuclear power plants as you would expect, and there is a reason for that. Over the last few decades, there have been a number of disasters surrounding nuclear power plants. They've caused a lot of damage to human life, animals, and property. The most famous incident that comes to mind is the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. When somebody gets exposed to radiation in large amounts, they're under unimaginable pain. This is exactly what happened with 35-year-old Hisashi Ouchi of Japan in 1999. He had to bear the effects of radiation for a full 83 days before he passed away. The story starts with Japan's natural resources. Japan has very few natural resources and relies on imports for its energy needs. Around 80% of Japan's energy is imported. They get 90% of their oil from the Middle East. That's not a sustainable way to run a country long term. After multiple oil crises in the 1970s, Japan chose to move towards nuclear energy, so they don't have to depend on sources they can't control. They reduced their dependence on oil once they got their nuclear plants running. This leads us to the Tokaimura nuclear plant, where an unfortunate incident occurred years later. The Tokaimura nuclear power plant was the first commercial plant in Japan. It started producing electricity in 1966, before a second unit was built at the site in the 1970s. It was also the first site that produced more than 1,000 megawatts of energy in Japan. The plant was built in Tokai. It was an ideal location because of the amount of land available. It wasn't long before there was a campus of nuclear reactors, fuel disposal facilities, and research institutes. Soon, more than a third of the population in the city depended on the power plant. At the plant, uranium hexafluoride would be converted into enriched uranium that could be used for nuclear energy. There were a number of steps involved in the process. They involved adding a number of elements at various stages in a sequence that needed to be carefully timed. Even before the disaster in 1999, the nuclear plant experienced another devastating event. On March 11, 1997, there was an explosion at one of the nuclear reactors.
There is no core. It exploded. The core exploded.
Dozens of people were exposed to radiation. The problem was that lessons weren't learned from the disaster. A government cover-up was quickly made so that the negligence was not exposed. It only resulted in an even bigger disaster a couple of years later. The horrifying nuclear disaster of 1999. By the time 1999 came around, the event from 2 years ago already seemed to have faded into the background. Officials at the plant were looking at ways to take shortcuts so that they could skip some of the steps involved in their process. But these experiments meant they missed a deadline for fuel delivery that was set for September 28. To make up for that delay, 3 employees at the plant tried another shortcut to see if it would work. These included Ouchi, his colleague Masato Shinohara, and their supervisor Yutaka Yokokawa. However, it turns out none of them really knew what they were doing. Normally, automatic pumps are used to mix nitric acid with around 5 pounds of enriched uranium. This is put into a vessel specifically designed for this purpose. But the 3 employees chose to do things differently. Instead of using the tools at their disposal, they poured 35 pounds of uranium into steel buckets. This was at 10 a.m. local time. By the time it was 10:35 a.m., the uranium had reached critical mass. There was an explosion with a blue flash, which was a sign that a nuclear chain reaction had taken place. Lethal radiation was released into the air and the plant was evacuated. The 3 colleagues were the most affected, since they were directly exposed. The unfortunate exposure to deadly radiation. If a human being is exposed to a degree of radiation equal to 7 sieverts, it can kill them. The supervisor, who was farthest away, was exposed to 3 sieverts and was the only one of the 3 that survived. Shinohara was exposed to as many as 10 sieverts. Ouchi was standing right over the bucket when the gamma rays were released into the room. It's no wonder he was the most exposed. His radiation exposure was as much as 17 sieverts. It was the most radiation that any human being had ever suffered.
それこそ、お話しするのも力がいるっていうかそういう感じだったと思うんですね。それでもなんかちょっと優しい口調で少し笑いながら奥さんに愛してるよとおっしゃってて、でもそういうのがやっぱり伝わってくると私たちは辛いですよね。
The devastating impact of the radiation. All 3 patients were brought to the University of Tokyo Hospital, and Ouchi's was the most stunning case. Ouchi had no white blood cells left, so his body had no immune system to fight off infection. At the hospital, Ouchi was kept in a radiation ward so that he could be kept away from any pathogens. He was in tremendous pain and flatlined multiple times after heart attacks. Each time the doctors revived him, he was kept alive for 83 days until another heart attack killed him. In a way, he was taken out of his misery. During Ouchi's first week in the hospital, doctors had multiple skin grafts and blood transfusions to alleviate his suffering. A cell transplant specialist suggested trying stem cell transplants, which would allow his body to generate blood on its own. This hadn't been tried before on radiation victims and was a revolutionary idea. Bone marrow transplants would have been the usual method. But stem cell transplants could work faster, especially with the stem cells donated by Ouchi's sister. It seemed the method actually worked on Ouchi. Unfortunately, the amount of radiation in his body was so overwhelming, it killed even the new cells. His DNA was unable to rebuild itself, so the skin grafts didn't hold. Ouchi couldn't handle all the experiments and preferred to die. But his family wasn't willing to give up, and they allowed the doctors to try other experimental treatments. The treatments continued even as Ouchi's skin began to melt away. On the 59th day of his suffering, Ouchi had a heart attack. The doctors revived him, but he would go on to have 3 more heart attacks in an hour. Every time he flatlined, he suffered brain damage, and his DNA would also be destroyed. It was a heart attack combined with multiple organ failure that finally relieved him from his suffering. This was on December 21st. What happened in the aftermath of the incident? The villagers living within 6 miles of the nuclear plant were ordered to stay indoors at least 24 hours after the explosion. Many were checked for radiation, and about 600 other people had minor exposure. No one was close to the kind of radiation suffered by Ouchi and Shinohara. Shinohara lasted longer than Ouchi, fighting for his life for 7 months. He received a similar treatment, with his transfusions taken from a baby's umbilical cord. The procedure didn't work, and Shinohara finally passed away on April 27, 2000, from lung and liver failure. Nuclear power is fascinating, but terrifying. So many devastating things could happen if something went wrong. Here to learn more? Let's keep your curiosity going with a couple more videos, shall we? Here's what you need to know. Check out how to survive a nuclear attack. Also, what if Hiroshima and Nagasaki never happened? Go ahead, click one, or better yet, watch both, and learn more about nuclear power. What about nuclear power keeps you up at night? Let us know in the comments below.